Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our second session. Please check your tickets. This is Planning Board Procedures and Policies. My name is Stephanie Verdial, and I'll be your host today. Just quickly, as we move through, again, please feel free to visit often our website. You can find previous plan webinars, previous conferences, current plan webinars, upcoming schedules, as well as a survey. Again, we're really encouraging people to participate in our anonymous survey of the conference. Let us know how we're doing and what types of sessions you may like to see in the future. If you'd like to have it in person, half a day, 2 days, let us know. As a reminder, we're trying something this year a little bit different in an effort to keep the sessions on time and for everyone to have their questions answered. We're holding off on detailed questions throughout the sessions. If there's a question on point, I'll be glad to try and answer it relatively quickly. But for that, we are going to have the planner is in and a session Q&A at the end of the day. So keep the questions coming in the chat. We will get to them at the end of the day. And again, you can raise your hand just as a refresher to open the chat, raise your hand, lower the hand, or those are in the ribbon bar either at the top or the bottom of your screen. If you do need to leave the meeting for any reason, you can hit the red hang up button. So again, good morning. I'm Stephanie Verdial. I am the principal planner here at the Office of Planning and Development. With me today is Alvina Snigic. She is an assistant planner with OPD. She's going to be keeping us on track for time and helping out with organizing the questions. So today there, may be some duplicate topics or duplicate things that we've discussed, that Steve discussed this morning. But if you're a planning board member, there's a lot to it. So there's going to be some crossover and some duplication. So I'm going to talk today about planning board organization, get a little bit into rules of procedure, the planning board application process, meaning acceptance and completeness, and waivers and checklists. Then I'm going to be talking a little bit about site walks. I know Steve touched on it a little bit. Again, there'll be some duplication, but it's important to remember for a board member how to everything that you're in charge of. I'm going to talk about third-party review, the technical review committee, and zoning amendments. Again, just kind of elaborating a little bit more on what Steve spoke about, and then I'm going to go through some board member responsibilities. So I'm sure if you've attended any of my sessions, you've seen this famous flow chart. So how do we get to the planning? So the municipality decides to create a planning board, and that is done through their legislative process, whether that is through town meeting or city council or town council form of government. And then that is according to RSA 673-2. The members are either appointed or elected to a planning board, and the RSA spells out for each town, how many members are supposed to have, or seven members or 9 members and alternates. So the RSA goes into a little bit more detail about how many members are to be appointed. But the warrant article that the town votes on, or the municipality, if you're a city, votes on, is spelled out as how many members there should be. Members of the planning board terms should be staggered, and the planning board the planning board member must be a resident of the municipality. So you've had your elections, you've decided to create a planning board. Their first order of business is the planning board has to elect officers, and that's according to RSA 673-8. The RSAs say the board shall elect a chairperson and may create other officers as it deems necessary. And so most boards elect their officers once a year after elections. Town meeting form of government, which reigns supreme in the state. Normally, those board elections would take place in April, but whenever you have your elections, usually the preceding month is when the planning board should be electing their officers. So in addition to the chair, it makes sense to have the vice chair. Also, I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of the secretary for the planning board. And I know that Steve spoke a little bit about it this morning, but I want to just kind of, again, elaborate and clarify some roles to have some roles and some positives for having a secretary to the planning board. So the chair is responsible to run the meetings. Okay. They are the spokesperson for the board. They are the ones to keep order by ensuring that everyone gets a fair chance to be heard. That includes board members, that includes the applicant, and that includes abutters and the public, for and against the application. The chair makes decisions on behalf of the board, and they have administrative duties as well. Like the chair will be the ones in charge of signing final plans, signing notices of decision, any letters or correspondence from the planning board are all the responsibility of the chair. So the chair is really the face of the planning board, the first line of face of the planning board. And the vice chair assumes all the duties of the chair in their absence. At any given time, they can also sign plans, sign letters, sign notices of decision, and correspondence from the board. So having a secretary of the board, they can also serve as a chair and vice chair. So if there, you have one of those events where the chair and the vice chair either have to recuse themselves or they're not able to attend a meeting, then the secretary can step in, and that actually is maybe one thing to save the day, so that you don't have to not hold a hearing because you don't have a quorum. So secretaries can step in and act as chair at meetings, as well as can sign correspondence and letters. Now, if you're a town that doesn't have staff, the chair can also the secretary can also serve as the contact person for whom the applications are physically submitted to. Just submit, send it across the counter. Okay, and at that point, the secretary just does a really preliminary review of the information. Do I have an owner's signature letter? Do I have fees? Okay, they are not doing an in-depth review of the application for merits. They are simply looking at whether or not this application includes all of the materials needed to be considered for a public hearing. So again, they really shouldn't be providing any other kind of comment or any other kind of opinion on it. It's their job, as what a land use administrative assistant would do, would just accept it across the counter, date stamp it in, check off everything, and then ready to be discussed at public hearing. So, the number one role, as you know, as a planning board member, or you should know as a planning board member, and it's spelled out in the RSAs, is the role of the planning board is to accept and decide upon applications. So, an application submitted to the planning board according to the meeting and the deadline schedule, or at a minimum, is 21 days before a public meeting. So, excuse me, before a public hearing. So I recommend that planning boards, you should, if you don't already, you should really have an annual schedule. Okay, that should be when your meetings are, if you meet the second Monday of the month, when that deadline is, and put that on your website. It's helpful to the public. It's also helpful to the planning board members. So according to 676.4.1b, the planning board shall specify by regulation, either in 674.36 in your subdivision regulations or 674.44 your site plan regulations. Those are the RSAs where you will find shall specify what constitutes a completed application sufficient to invoke jurisdiction to obtain approval. A completed application means that sufficient information is included to allow the board to proceed with consideration and make an informed decision. So that's what a complete application is, spelled out in statute. And so in order to achieve the requirements of 676.4, the planning board must adopt subdivision and site plan regulations. Subdivision and site plan regulations also should include a checklist. The checklists are for the public and the applicant to know and understand what's expected of them, and in order to have a complete application to the board. So you can consider your checklist almost like your cliff notes of your regulations. Checklists are part of what their submission of requirements is to make each application complete. And because we need that safety valve from any regulation, as you all know from all the training that you've attended, that anytime you have a regulation, you need a safety valve for it, some type of relief. So what a variance is to the zoning ordinance for a valve of relief, waivers are the relief for your checklist for your planning board applications. So like I said, RSA 674-36 and 674-44 require that the planning board allow for waivers for the subdivision and our site plan regulations, stating that they may and shall, may for subdivision, shall for site plan regulations, include provisions for waiver of any portion of the regulations. So that is what you have to spell out in your site plan and subdivision regulations, that there is a provision for relief from that. So in order to grant a waiver or request a waiver, grant a waiver, right, applicants must show good cause, that strict conformity of the regulations would cause an unnecessary hardship. It kind of sounds a little bit like a variance when you talk about hardship, whether or not what restrictions, regulations could put on an application, and that a waiver would not go against the spirit and the intent of the regulations. Again, kind of sounds like a variance again, but it's the same meaning. It's the same, that safety valve, that same relief. That is what waivers are for. Waiver requests should be in writing, and they should identify the specific section of the regulation for which you're asking for relief from. It can't just be, I'm asking for a waiver from your regulations. Okay, the applicant is responsible to cite the specific section of the regulations that they are asking to be considered. The board should be clear in the reason for granting or not granting the waiver. Okay, part of this waiver decision making, when the board is considering a waiver, you have to remember what you go back to the RSA that says what constitutes a completed application. So basically, the board should be asking when considering waiver requests from their regulations, is there enough information to make an informed decision? Will this affect the information we need in order for us to hear and decide this application? So those are the kinds of things that the board needs to be thinking about when they make their decision to grant the waiver. So if the answer is yes, you would grant the waiver. Make sure that the board is putting that in writing, even included in these findings of facts now and those types of things, that you have to be clear. Put things in writing and you have to be clear. You know, we like to say you can't enforce intent, right? So you can't enforce whether or not a waiver was granted or what the parameters were around that waiver being granted. So make sure that it's clear and that it's in writing. Once that you say yes to that waiver request, then as Steve spoke about, that 65-day review clock starts. And just kind of as here's a little reminder, as just a practice pointer, is the order of when the planning board should accept an application as complete. So if I have an application that comes in front of me and there's waiver requests for a wetland study or a wetland scientist stamp, okay, I'm going to consider that waiver, and I should not be granting that waiver if the plan doesn't include wetlands. That's one of those things where I need that information in order to make an informed decision. So I shouldn't be accepting an application as complete and then considering a waiver request for a wetland scientist stamp when I, as a board member, need that information. I need to know where the wetlands are. I need to know where the boundaries are. I need to know where buffers are. So the order of business should be for an acceptance of an application is that you consider waivers first, yes or no. If you grant the waiver, give and if you don't grant the waiver, but if you're discussing waivers, your decision needs to be in writing, and then move forward to accepting the application as complete. Because if you do it kind of any other order that way, is I've accepted the application as complete, but there's a waiver request for a wetland scientist, and I need that wetland scientist's signature and stamp on the plan, then I have to wait 30 days or 15 days or whatever. I'm wasting time of the 65-day review clock because you've accepted it as complete. The 65-day clock starts. If there's missing information and you're going to work with the applicant to submit that information, you're missing your time. And especially with the RSAs that have been changed regarding the 65-day clock, I would highly encourage you, and you always hear me say, talk to your town attorney, but don't accept an application as complete and then address any kind of waiver requests, because you're kind of shorting yourself, and it makes the process a little bit more, hard to complete with. So if you said no for a waiver request, if you're not granting a waiver request, then that means that the application is incomplete. So again, you need to state in writing why the application is incomplete, and it's incomplete because you did not provide a wetland scientist stamp. So you deem the application incomplete. If there is no checklist submitted, if there's no waiver request submitted or waivers granted, no other items submitted that you need to make an informed decision, then you should not be accepting the application as complete. You have your cliff notes and your checklists, and that goes out to the applicant. The applicant then submits an application and says, yes, I have met all of these requirements. I can't meet all these requirements because there's a hardship. I'm going to submit a waiver. Please consider this waiver request. And then if the board doesn't request or grant that waiver request, the application doesn't go forward. There's no public hearing. It's deemed incomplete. The applicant is told that. And like Steve was speaking about, it's the duty of boards and municipalities to work with the applicants. The board should be very clear about what is missing and what the applicant needs to submit in order to make the application complete. So applicant, you don't have a wetland scientist stamp on your plans. Come back with new plans with the stamped wetland scientist seal on it, and then we will reconsider it for acceptance. That's how those do. Yep.
Sorry to interrupt. So there are a few questions that are coming in. Some I guess you can answer after, but some are about the waivers right now. So you want to take the crack at that one. So let me rephrase the question. So it was two questions in one. Is it proper for the planning board to frequently grant waivers as many as 4 to 6 per application? Doesn't this obviate the purpose of the planning board? And then Tara answered that the planning board can't waive zoning.
Right. That's right. So zoning is variances. Okay. Waivers are subdivision, site plan, or any other planning board regulation. So if when you're talking about waivers from the zoning ordinance, and again, I used to tell my board members, sometimes we have to be really clear about, what words we're using and how we're describing something. So a waiver from the planning board is site plan, subdivision, excavation regs, driveway regs, whatever those systems are. A variance from the zoning ordinance is only issued through the zoning board of adjustment. So if the planning board is issuing, I'll say this, if the planning board is issuing a lot of waivers, excuse me, based on certain sections of their regulations, then my answer to that would be that you may want to check those regulations themselves. Similar with the zoning ordinance. If I'm getting a lot of variance requests for a certain definition or a certain section of the zoning ordinance, then maybe I need to sit down, talk with the town attorney, talk with town staff, and maybe figure out that maybe it's the wording that is the problem. So I'll carry over that same theory to the planning board when you're talking about site plan and subdivision regulations, that if you're getting a lot of waiver requests, it may be time to look at that section as to why. So I hope that answered.
And another one is somebody says, I missed something. Jim, I missed something. Do we hear waivers before accepting as complete? We've been doing it backwards if that's the case.
It's my recommendation, and my caveat always is to check with your town attorney, but it's how I used to do it. And for my communities and when I was a town planner is that you grant, it goes back to what makes an application complete and what makes the information in order for the board to make an informed decision. And so if you are accepting an application as complete and then granting waivers, then what if you're not going to grant a waiver and you need information? Like I said, with the wetland scientist stamp, you've already accepted the application as complete. That starts the 65-day clock. So I would reverse the order and I would have discussion with the board and staff that whether or not you're going to grant the waiver, because the checklist is the completeness avenue, right? In order to have a complete application, we need A, B, C, D, E, F, G. So the secretary of the planning board takes that in and looks and says, yep, they submitted A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Oh, wait, they have a waiver. So that waiver needs to be considered by the planning board. The planning board will consider that waiver. Either yes, we'll grant that waiver, or no, we're not going to grant that waiver. So if they've granted that waiver, that means that they are accepting this application as complete with a waiver, meaning they now have enough information to make an informed decision. And that 65-day clock begins as soon as they have accepted the application as complete. If you're doing it the other way, I would say check with your town attorney. They're the ones that have to defend you. But if you are granting a waiver after you've accepted as complete, you shouldn't be moving on with the public hearing because you don't have the information needed to make an informed decision. And you're going to say to the applicant, okay, come back with your wetland stamp. Well, now you've just wasted all that time. You've wasted till the next meeting, or you've wasted a week or 2 weeks or whatever of your 65-day review period. So how I do it is consider waivers, then accept it as complete. But again, check with your town attorney. They're the ones who have to defend you.
One more, Stephanie. How do you handle an application that hasn't requested a waiver for something they should have, and the application has been accepted and the need for a waiver arises in the process of reviewing the application in a public hearing? Specific example has to do with a lot line buffer regulation.
I'm going to put that off. If you're okay with that, we'll put that off to the panel for at the end of the day, because I think that Steve Buckley may be able to have you know, a little bit better of a legal opinion for that. So if you don't mind, those are the kinds of questions that I think would be great for the roundtable. And if there isn't anything else on point quickly for the waivers, then I'll pick up where I left off.
The other one is pretty, I think it would be better for Steve too. It's about RSA 674-21. And it allowing the planning board to waive zoning, which again, I think would be better addressed in a longer setting. And another one is, does addressing waivers before acceptance of an application vest the project?
We'll discuss that with Steve, because I don't, you know, you started the review clock, and you go back to read the RSA as far as when, you know, if they've been to a public hearing and it's been accepted, then I don't know the RSA language off the top of my head. I do talk about that a little bit, but let's hold off on that for clarification from Steve at the end of the day. The great questions, and they're very helpful. So let's hang on to those questions for the end of the day.
Thank you, Stephanie. I will put them in a Word doc and send them to Steve before the session.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Okay. Again, so let's back up here a little bit. So if there is no checklist submitted, there's no waiver request submitted or waivers granted, and there's no other items that were submitted by the applicant that are needed to make an informed decision, then you should not be accepting the application as complete. You can't, you know, you'll hear it a lot. I'm stressing it a lot already. You need the information in order to make an informed decision. And if an applicant is not, when you have spelled that out in your regulations and in your checklist, it's available to the public, it's available to the applicants. They are aware of what is expected of them in order for them to have an application that you would accept as complete. If they are not submitting what you require, they need a waiver. And if you're not going to grant that waiver and they haven't submitted what you require, then you should not be accepting the application as complete. When there, you can, again, like Steve said this morning, that you're you know, working with the applicant, you need to explain to the applicant, which is why you put it in writing, what is expected of them. And included in your regulations, also the rules of procedure should also spell out what happens with applications that are incomplete and you know, like a broken record. work with your town attorney on all of your procedures, on your rules of procedure, all of your board policies. They're the ones that have to defend you, and they're the ones that should be giving you, the legal ramification parameters for what you're able to ask for. Resubmission on an application that was deemed incomplete should include resubmission of application fees. Okay, and I know this doesn't make people happy, and I've dealt with it myself. But if I have an application that has gone through the town process, that it's gone through town staff, it's been reviewed, it's been processed, it's been copied, it's been delivered, the town and the municipality, maybe even engineer review, have all expended, time and energy and resources on that application. Not to mention that, notice to the public, which yes, is paid for by the applicant. So resubmission, that's a new application. You still need to notice the abutters, you still need to notice the public, because you can't have a public hearing if without abutters or without the public knowing about it. So you're probably going to get pushback from applicants who say, I've already paid fees. Yes, you have. That was, presented at a public hearing, it wasn't heard. Check with your town attorney, but I would require notification fees and application fees. It has to go through the same process again. So just make sure that you spell that out in your regulations. You spell that out in the board policies, the board rules of procedure. And again, as a reminder that, applications that are not materially, meaning significant and or relevant changes, different than what they've submitted originally, and that don't comply with the regulations, should be rejected. So again, stick to your regulations and your checklists and your waivers and your policies and your procedures, and that if you're not submitting everything that we need and we have not granted you a waiver, then that application should be rejected. So let's say you've accepted the application is complete, and like Steve spoke about, which is also, I think, really good things for boards to do, is now you're doing a site walk. So site walks are very beneficial for the board, and the public and abutters. Having a visual experience to go along with a paper application can be very helpful. It can give you the layout of the land. You can look and see how tall buildings would be. You can look and see where traffic would come. So site walks are very important for the boards. Like Steve said, site walks are public meetings, so they have to be noticed with an agenda. They have to comply with 91A. It includes date, time, location, and discussion. So normally what I would do for a site walk is that I would just take the, the advertisement on the agenda or the public hearing notice, and put that into your site walk. So it's the address, the location, and the application, just a brief description of why you're at that site walk and the location. It is a meeting, so minutes must be kept. So either the board secretary or staff to the planning board would keep minutes. And we all know what minutes need to contain, right? They need to contain the date, time, location, people involved, people who attended, and topics discussed. So something else to, again, verify with your town attorney is that the property owner for whom the application has been submitted for must consent to allow the board members and the public to visit the site if they have, an active application in. If that consent is not given, then the site visit, needs to be canceled. They can't go any further. You have it one way. You can't have it both ways. You can't have an application in front of the board for the public, and then not allow people on the property. So if a property owner is not allowing a site walk to commence on that property for which they've submitted an application, then the site walk needs to be canceled, and check with your town attorney. And one more thing that I wanted to mention, sorry, let me back up for 2 seconds, about the minutes for a site walk. Make sure you keep those minutes with that application. It is part of the record of that application, so that you can keep track of the history and know what they talked about at the site walk. And site walk minutes, like any other board minutes, are a draft form, and they are also to be approved at a public meeting. So individual members can do a drive-by of the site if they wish, and a lot of planning board members, zoning board members, do that. It's pretty convenient. You can't do 2 or more. Don't do it with another board member. If you happen to see each other there, okay, just go your separate ways. But you have to be very careful about having a meeting, and 2 board members constitute a meeting. So you've accepted an application is complete, you've conducted a site walk, and now you're ready to do some review. So we'll discuss third-party review. Okay, why have third-party review? RSA 676-4B allows planning boards to enlist third-party review, and I highly recommend. A couple of things are my favorite things. I love TRCs, and I love the third-party review. I love having engineers on staff working on behalf of the town. Okay, the experts and the engineers, they're great to have. That expert opinion. They need someone to be looking out on the town's behalf. Okay, and they are great for large applications. They're great for maybe, controversial applications of whether or not something should be, fit into the town. So it's best to have a third-party engineer review. There are planning boards, there are land use boards that do have experts. There's realtors, there's surveyors, there's engineers, there's lawyers. But for the majority of planning boards out there, we're volunteers, and we're doing this on our own time. So we may not have the expertise for drainage and slopes, and especially with new board members coming on, even experienced board members. There's going to be some issues. There's going to be some case in front of you that you're going to be, like, we need some help with this. And I just highly recommend that communities use that as often as possible, because the law allows for it and there is no cost to the municipality. Yet the municipality is getting the liability and the protection and someone working on their behalf professionally. So check with your town attorney, but if you do, you can do an RFP process to contract with an engineer, have them on staff all the time so that every application that comes through the planning board gets an engineering review. So the role of the engineer, like I said, they're the expert, right? So they're going to report back to the board. They work for the board, and they work for the municipality on their behalf. And so it is no expense to the town, as the law provides the applicant to pay for the third-party review. So if you're going to do an RFP process for it and have an engineer, contract on staff for planning board applications, so the town would contract with an engineer, and you can work out and check with your town attorney, as always. Work out with the town engineer about, what they would cost would be for a major subdivision and a site plan, minor, any other kind of review. So say a major and minor site plan is a $500 initial review. A minor site plan, a minor subdivision is $100. So that applicant, it's in your fees, it's in your regulations that you have engineering review. So that application comes across the desk, it's got a $500 engineering review. So that is where the town can put that engineer to work as a preliminary review to help them through that application, through that process. Each application should have its own escrow account. Okay, so the Walmart has a $500 engineering review. Then an escrow account needs to be opened with that $500. That $500 goes to pay the engineer for his initial review or subsequent reviews of that application. It's no cost to the town. It's paid for by the applicant, and you are getting professional, sound engineering review and help you make your decision. The money can't go into different accounts. Every application to a general fund account, excuse me. So every application needs to be set up its own account. So again, they provide review on behalf of the municipality. They can support your basis for your approval or denial. They can refute applicants' experts on behalf of the municipality. Okay, so my applicant's engineer says, oh, the wetlands impact is only going to be 5,000 square feet. Okay, so the town should be enlisting their own expert and have that be their tool. Okay, so if the town's expert says, oh, well, the impact is 10,000 square feet, then the board has a decision to make and can work from that. But 99.9% of the time, the engineer, the board is going to follow their engineers. You shouldn't let the fox guard the hen house. You shouldn't be letting applicant engineers come in and say that, don't worry, the traffic will be fine. Our study says it's going to be fine. The board should be enlisting third-party engineer for their own protection and for their own liability issues. So it can be very important to have engineering and for liability and for protection issues, as far as who's going to look out for the town. You've been in a municipality where they didn't have engineering review on some road design standards, and I'm sure you can imagine the nightmare and long nightmare that not having an engineer review and taking the word of a developer for a residential neighborhood had with their roads. So if you don't want that to happen in your neighborhood, I would seriously encourage you to research and work with your town attorney, work with town staff, and come up with an RFP for your third-party review. So you have your third-party review for your professional engineer. Another one of my favorites, which I've said, is the Technical Review Committee. Love the TRC. Okay, so the TRC is, in order to have one in your community, you must have a zoning ordinance, which means you must have a site plan regulations. So the town is voted under 674-43 to give the planning board the authority to regulate site plans, which are anything commercial, change of use, multifamily developments. So according to 674-43-3, if the local legislative body of a municipality may by ordinance or resolution authorize the planning board to delegate its site review powers and duties in regard to minor site plans to a committee, hence TRC. So on the planning board, in order to do this, they must amend their site plan regulations in order to account for the TRC. And so in that, like a little bit like what Steve was speaking about before, is that in the site plan regulations, the planning board will say the TRC will be responsible for change of use applications, anything, under 10,000 square feet would go to the minor site plan review committee. That there's two, to review minor site plans, it has to be spelled out in the warrant. Okay, so the special site review committee may have final authority to approve or disapprove site plans reviewed by it, and that has to be spelled out in that initial warrant. You can still have a TRC without site plan review approval, but that special review approval to be the mini planning board needs to be spelled out in the warrant. So a TRC is a committee appointed and authorized by the legislative bodies of the municipality, like we just spoke about, the RSA. This is usually, it's made up of municipal officials and department heads, like Steve spoke about, or other board or commission members. So like Steve said, this is usually the department heads, DPW, police, planning, town administrator. You could have conservation on there. You should have schools on there. They may not attend all the time, but if you've got an application for 25 houses coming in, it may be beneficial to let the schools know and be interested in their input as well. There is a chair and a vice chair. Like I said, it's a mini planning board. So there is a chair and a vice chair. You're making decisions. So they have the same roles. Again, will be spelled out in the planning board's site plan review regulations, but a chair and vice chair of a TRC, because they're making decisions, they're making decisions on applications. They have the same roles as with the planning board. And again, so the legislative body would be to determine whether or not the TRC would have site plan review authority or not. And so why would you go through the trouble to have a TRC? It's a good practice to include it as part of the development review process. Having well-informed board members as well as other municipal departments is very helpful for the development review process. It provides that connection between the other departments, knowing what's going on, the police department, ambulance, school, fire. It's very important for them to keep up to date with what's going on in the town and provide input is valuable to the planning board. It's that technical assistance that they can provide to the applicant as well. Instead of having the applicant run around town to the fire department, police department, ambulance, sewer, water, DPW, having a TRC committee with a monthly, a schedule. The way that I used to do it is TRC would meet in between planning board meetings, so that there was one meeting, set date and time. If there was applicants for them to review, TRC got their planning board packet, they got their TRC packet just like a planning board packet. And at a meeting, they had time to review the application, they had time to review the information, and then explain all of that to the applicant. So it's very beneficial that the applicant has everyone in the room at the same time. Every department's concerns are being, department's concerns over the application or comments are being addressed. And it's very helpful. It's very helpful to streamline the development process. Keeps all the departments involved in the process. And again, it's creating and fostering that communication and that cooperation with the planning board, other departments, and the applicant. So that would be your TRC with site plan review authority is, they can take those smaller site plans and approve them. So again, they have to create the threshold. The planning board would dictate in their site plan regulations what TRC would be reviewing for site plans that would come in front of them. Again, planning board creates the criteria thresholds for what constitutes minor site plans and including changes of use. So the TRC is either included in the zoning ordinance or the planning board regulations. Spoke a little bit more about the zoning ordinance, but it also can be in the site plan regulations. So check with your town attorney about when if you're interested or if you want to start a TRC, that would be the process of it. TRC is great for change of use, like we've said. Okay. It's, if I have a bookstore and, retail, and it's going from retail to a professional office in an existing building where office is allowed and there's parking and there's sewer and there's water, I'm just changing signs, changing interior. Change of use needs to go to the planning board. That's something that can be handled at TRC, and is providing a big service to the planning board because they don't have to review that. That's a lot to go to the planning board to change from a bookstore to a CPA kind of office. So change of use applications to a TRC with site plan review authority. It's very helpful for the town and it's helpful for the applicant. So again, TRC with site plan approval authority, it alleviates the planning board from having to review minor site plans or changes of use, which is a huge help. It streamlines the development process for the applicant. It saves the municipality and the developer time and money because you can take care of things at one meeting instead of, waiting for an applicant to run around and catch up with department heads. And meanwhile, a planning board meeting may have come and gone and they still don't have comments and still aren't able to catch up. If everyone is at one meeting and take care of it, it streamlines the process, saves a lot of time and money for everybody. Another thing with TRC with site plan review authority or not is really helpful is that they can provide conceptual input for an applicant. And again, since this is a meeting of a committee, then minutes need to be taken. So those minutes will then be turned over to the planning board. So I come in for a conceptual, I get ideas from the department heads that can then help prepare me better for appearing in front of the planning board. If you have a TRC without site plan approval, still very beneficial for the community. It still streamlines the development process. It still saves the municipality time and money. And again, it provides that conceptual review even without having site plan review authority. And just as review, both TRC with site plan review authority and without, it fosters cooperation with municipal departments. It informs the departments of large projects. It also can help departments with budgeting the CIP. Okay, you may not really think about that, but if departments know or are seeing a development trend, there's large housing developments coming, there's a large industrial coming, then they can use that for their budgets. How much police and fire are we going to need to cover another, 250 houses in our community kind of thing. So there's a lot of benefits with TRC. So we're going to briefly move on to talk about the other main function of the planning board, and Steve spoke a little bit about that as well. Instead of including reviewing applications, it's zoning amendments. And a zoning amendment is any change to the zoning ordinance, which includes language, table, or graphics or maps that's approved by the legislative body. So again, that's something that goes to town meeting. The planning board is required to hold at least one public hearing on proposed zoning amendments in order to prepare them for the ballot. So, if you've seen any of my, it's zoning amendment time webinars, that some of these tips will sound familiar to you, but they're always good to have, keep in the back of your head. We've come through town meeting, we're getting into the summertime. So now would be the time to start, thinking about getting your zoning amendment scheduled together. I used to do it in the summertime with my planning boards, and it's not the best time of the year. I understand that, to be working on exciting zoning amendments, but it is very helpful to start early. And so, like what we spoke about a little bit before, like one of the first things you should be doing to prepare for zoning amendments is to review sections of your ordinance that have resulted in a lot of, variances. That's the best way to go about it. There's something wrong, whether it's too restrictive or it's too confusing or it's not necessary anymore. For whatever the case may be, review with your town attorney and with your staff, because you're getting a lot of variances, then something is wrong with your regulations. Talk with your municipal land use boards and other staff. What, the Conservation Commission may be looking at, the Wetlands Conservation Overlay District and find that some things are outdated or so. So make sure that you're communicating with other boards and other staff members, other department heads in town. The zoning ordinance is the community rule book, so everyone uses it. So to take other opinions and experiences as to how they find the language, if it's confusing, those are things that you should be looking at and considering for zoning amendments. I'm sure you've heard me say this before if you've attended any of my zoning amendment sessions. Review the table of permitted uses and the definitions. You should not have a definition that doesn't have a corresponding use. Neither should you have a use without a corresponding definition. Okay, the table of permitted uses and definitions are like the meat and potatoes of your zoning ordinance. I want to put, a merry-go-round and have a fair on my front lawn. So you got to define what a fair is, or a carnival. You got to, find out where it's located. So when people want to do something with their property, they need to know, how it's defined and where it can be done. The essence of zoning, right? Land uses, where they're allowed and what can be used. So if your table of permitted uses and your definitions don't match, or you don't have one or the other, it makes it very difficult for the public and for staff to help people with what they would like to do with their property. And for definitions, you can, the Supreme Court has used, and other courts have used, just the plain old dictionary. The American Planning Association does have a planner's dictionary that'll give you some examples of definitions. What one community calls a motel may be a little bit different than what another community calls a motel. But when in doubt, the goal of definitions and the goal of your zoning and all of your regulations is to have the language easy to understand. So if you're using the dictionary, there's nothing wrong with that, because that's what courts will say. What, normal person, average person off the street would consider to be, would understand this definition. So, have your town attorney review everything as always, but don't have your town attorney be writing zoning amendments. Sometimes the legal language is very confusing. So you want to just, propose your zoning amendments, present them to the town attorney, explain to them, what your intent is, what you're trying to accomplish with your zoning amendment, and they're reviewing it just for legal soundness, not legal language. If you have any state laws in your in your zoning ordinance, then I would consider updating that to cite that RSA as amended. Because if you don't do that and the state changes their law, you may be playing catch up with your zoning ordinance. So if you have, Comprehensive Shoreline Protection Act or wetlands, RSAs in your zoning ordinance, you may want to consider and talk with your town attorney about citing as amended after their state RSAs. Another thing I think would be a really good idea, because we all know in the town form of government, anytime you want to make a change to the zoning ordinance, it has to go to town meeting, meaning that there's a lot, the planning board has to hold a hearing, it has to be prepared, noticed, written, updated. So we all know in the town meeting form of government, it's a lot of work to do zoning amendments. So if you find a mistake, a typo, or something that does not affect any substance of your zoning ordinance, speak with your town attorney about creating a housekeeping clause. That's something that would say the planning board has the authority to assign and modify numbering and sections to the zoning ordinance, provided that no substantial change to the ordinance shall occur as a result of the changes. It may be very helpful. You can make corrections to the zoning ordinance, but it's just hard to do. Take up a zoning amendment to correct a typo. So it would be something worthwhile to consider speaking with your town attorney about instituting a housekeeping clause. Like I said, start early in the process in the summertime. It's the most wonderful time of year. I used to tell my planning board members for zoning amendment time. So it also, you may want to consider adding a work session to your schedule. Planning board should really have work schedules, workshop meetings anyway. So, but having your work session just for zoning amendments is very, very helpful, because if you have more than one, you only have one meeting a month, then it's zoning amendment time, and you've got applications in front of you, and you have to discuss zoning amendments all at the same meeting. We used to have a rule by 9:30 at night, we don't take any more new information. we're done. We're not going to take on anything new. So, having a little bit more organization with your board, and yes, I understand it's another meeting a month, and how, that can impact people and their time and their spare time. But, planning boards, as you have a lot of work to do. There is a lot to be expected of you. And to be considering applications and zoning amendments at the same meeting, it can be very exhausting. So I would just recommend, adopting, rules of procedure, and to maybe, consider and talk to your town attorney about maybe adding a second meeting a month. Maybe it could even be temporary from, June to, September or something like that. But work sessions are very helpful. Make sure that you keep a running list of your amendments all year long so that we all remember, and they're good discussion points for the planning board. You can present a list to the planning board that said, these are the issues that we've run into, and then the planning board can make the decision as to what ones, with staff and with other board input, which amendments should move forward. Make sure you're keeping good records and notes of your meetings and what the board discussed and what they considered. You should have, administratively, you should be keeping, 2022 amendments, 2023 amendments. By law, we need to make sure that we are noticing them in time. So you should be keeping track of those as well. Make sure there's somebody, whether the secretary of the planning board or other town staff, that is cross-checking to make sure that what you're proposing as a zoning amendment is in direct conflict with your master plan or other regulations. If you change a zoning amendment and it has to do with something in the site plan regulations and you haven't updated that, then you're creating a conflict and you're creating confusion. So it would be best to make sure that you are cross-checking your regulations. And don't take on too many zoning amendments. Okay, there's communities that put too many zoning amendments up and they end up all failing. So don't overload the public with zoning amendments. I would say if 10 is way too much. I mean, depending on what they are, but I would say 10 zoning amendments is way too much. I would probably stop at 7, maybe even 8 would make me a little bit nervous. That's a lot for people to try to understand. So talk with your town attorney on the board. If you do have a lot of zoning amendments, then talk to the town attorney, advertise real well, maybe even have more hearings, whatever the case may be. If you do have a need to have, a lot of zoning amendments, but I would really try and limit the number. You've got a better chance of it passing. So this was at 67612. Again, we can talk a little bit later in the day about this with Steve, but this is, I used to take advantage of this all the time. And if you're a March town meeting form of government, to back up 120 days, that would put you somewhere in November. I think I used to remember that, somewhere around Veterans Day, that second week of November was 120 days from a traditional March meeting. That's when I would hold my first public hearing. And that could be for the easy ones, the low hanging fruit zoning amendments. So you've advertised, you've had the public hearing in November. So those are done, they're out of the way. And town meeting form of government, we all know it comes at a really, hard time of year. You have Thanksgiving, Christmas, holidays, travel, New Year's. People take vacations, inclement weather. You have a short period of time that you're with very, very strict noticing requirements and deadline requirements. So the earlier that you can start having those public hearings complete, and then have enough time for maybe your more in-depth zoning amendment, or maybe even a controversial one where you are pretty certain you're probably going to have a second public hearing. Start the low-hanging fruit early. So we've got zoning amendments. We've got our TRC, which is very beneficial. We've done third-party review. We've done site walks. So we've talked about everything that board members are in charge of. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some tips about how to be a good board member. Okay, as a board member, you are either elected by your fellow residents of your community, or you were appointed. You've applied. You're interested, which is great, because volunteers for land use boards and communities, they're not lined up around the building waiting to get in, jumping at every opportunity to get on a land use board. So we're very appreciative of the dedication in your time and your civic duty to serve your community. So you've taken on that responsibility, and people in the community think that you're going to do a good job. So do your homework. Okay, you've got homework to do, and it's a lot, and it's time consuming. But those people have voted or appointed you to implement the regulations, to work on behalf of the town. So come prepared to the meeting. I understand life gets in the way. I used to be a planning board member. It is pretty hard to prepare yourself, but it's pretty important that you do your homework, especially because a lot of time and energy and effort from the applicant and town staff is put into giving you those materials to prepare you. So you should be able to do your homework. If you are, it's your duty to be fair and unbiased. Okay, and Steve spoke a little bit about this as well, as being a good board member. But you've been appointed, you've been elected, you've won elected, you won your election. You need to be fair, and you need to be unbiased, and represent your town and represent your regulations of what the town wants. Right? We have our master plan. Our master plan says how the community wants to be developed. How does the community get there? It gets there through their land use regulations, for which the planning board is in charge of. So now you are a planning board member. You are in charge of those land use regulations. You are the steward of the town for how the town is to reach their goals for their development and for their growth. So it's important for you to be unbiased. You may not like every application that comes in front of you, but if the application meets your regulations, you have ways of putting conditions of approval on that application that they have to adhere to, as well as their regulations. So just do your best to be fair and unbiased. Another thing is, please attend the meetings. I mean, I know it sounds silly, but you've been elected and appointed. People have chosen you to represent them. So make sure that you're attending the meetings as they're scheduled. You should work with staff on learning the ordinances. Okay, a little bit of history as to why we have something can go a long way. Why do we have site plan regulations that say, we need 40% street trees planted? Okay, whatever. So, but it's important to learn the history of your regulations. It helps with your decision making. Cooperate with other boards. Again, it's really important for all the boards in town to get along. You all have different missions, but you all have the same mission, which is, working on the town's behalf to obtain the goals that the town set out to do through their master plan and through their land use regulations. So you have a lot of responsibility, and it's a thankless job, and communities can't run without you. But you also need to, do a lot of work on that as far as your homework, learning your regulations, work with other boards, work with staff. Again, and be respectful of other board members and the public. Okay, there people who attend planning board meetings. The application is controversial, right? Because we've all sat at planning board meetings, and the only people in the audience have been applicants. When an application is controversial, that's when your planning board room is full. So be respectful to fellow board members and the public. Land use issues can be very emotional for a lot of people involved. So please, again, you are representing the town. People have chosen you to represent the town and represent their interests. Again, a little bit like what Steve talked about, don't communicate via email. Okay. Just don't do it. Okay. Staff can send you information. They can send you your packets. They can send you your agenda and your minutes and all of that. Don't hit reply all. Pick up the phone and call if you have a question. Don't put it in an email. Check with your town attorney as always. But boards should not be communicating via email. Like Steve said, don't use social media. Okay. It's just not worth it. The case that he talked about, the Z1 Express case, it's just not worth it. Speak with your town attorney. Maybe that's something that the board should come up with policies about how to handle, social media. We all like our social media. We all like to keep up to date, like to follow stuff on Twitter. But really, as part of your responsibility, to be fair, is to not comment on social media. Don't develop or express any opinions. Again, it goes along the line with being fair. Don't say to someone at the grocery store, "Oh, I'm not going to vote for that application." Yeah, no, don't do that. Because it's a recipe for disaster. Okay, every opinion and things that you want to discuss about an application need to be taken place at a public hearing. So just try to keep that in mind. Politely say to people, "Hey, what do you think about this case? You know what? It's before me. We'll talk about it at the meeting, but don't be kibitzing about applications and with other board members and the public." Kind of like what Steve said, do not abstain from voting. It is, again, it's your duty, it's your responsibility. You've been elected to that position to represent people. You've been appointed at that position that people think you're going to do a good job. You wanted that position. Not all decisions are going to make everyone happy, but just don't abstain. You can recuse yourself when appropriate, and kind of like what Steve spoke about. There's the RSA talks about the juror standards, and it's use some common sense too. I mean, there's a little bit of chatter this morning about a family member who's a relative of the applicant or something. If that was me, I would probably err on the side of caution, because in addition to having a big responsibility as a planning board member and being the steward of your community and how your community's growth and development looks and how its conservation will look, you also have transparency to work with and to be making sure there's no behind the scenes going on is very important in this day and age. It's even more important. So if you are related to either party, and a butter is a good example. If you're in a butter, you should probably abstain. You should recuse yourself. So that doesn't mean that you can't speak. If I live next door to, a development that's going in and I'm a planning board member, I would definitely make the announcement at the planning board meeting. I would talk to the chair and say, "Hey, this application, I'm in a butter," or, "Hey, this application, my brother is the engineer." So I would discuss with the chair. I would announce it at a public hearing. And ultimately, the decision to recuse does rest on me, and no one can force me off of an application. But the decision is mine. But I do have to be aware of the ramifications of that. Even if my brother is the engineer, yeah, that should be recusal. So it's important to make sure that you are not showing biased, right? You're supposed to be, fair and not be biased. And if you are related in some way, you're going to earn money some way, you've advised or assisted the party, anything along those lines. And a butter doesn't mean that I'm going to give up my right to comment. I can certainly comment as a member of the public. But you should be very, for upfront with any kind of relationship that you have with an applicant. Now, having said that, it's really hard in a small town to not have some kind of professional or financial relationship with someone. So and so used to be my boss, and now they're coming before us for an applicant approval. So again, talk about it at the public hearing, make the chair aware of it, let the board members be aware of it, let the applicant be aware of it, and make the offer to recuse or not. But if you've set it up front and it's I worked for him 10 years ago, it's a small town, yes, there is going to be some leeway, but make sure that you're being transparent about it. And again, having said all of that, I'll go back to, when in doubt, don't. It's just best to recuse yourself. So I think that is actually, how am I doing on time here? Because
we got about 10 minutes left.
Okay, well, you know what? It's something that I just realized. I think I had a glitch in my slides before because I did not, if I can find it here. See, missing. Oh no, okay. I thought I missed third party review, but no, I did not miss third party review. So that ends my session. I mean, I guess a few more minutes left. I can, if there's a few short questions. And
quite a few questions we have, Stephanie. Okay. So if I can, I can share the document I have that I have going with the questions. Maybe you can start, and the remainder will be addressed at the Q&A session later. You want to do that? Okay, let me share my screen with the document. Is everybody seeing it? Oh, it went away. Hang on a second. My email showed up. There we go. Are we all seeing the questions?
Yes.
Okay. So here we go. I'm going to go to the top. The yellow one you already answered. Okay. I can enlarge them. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. And so it has a timestamp and a question and who asked it.
Okay.
You want to read them?
Sure. When the state approves a wetland building permit, septic, can the town disapprove? That sounds like a little bit legally, and I'm gonna. They keep kind of flashing in and out, Alvina.
I know. Sorry.
When the state approves a wetland building permit, septic, can the town disapprove? I'm going to leave that to Steve because, I'm not sure why the town would disapprove that.
So I'll highlight it in a different color.
That'd be great. I mean, the town can have, more strict regulations than the state can. But I'm not really sure why the town would disapprove of a state one. So maybe that's a good one to save for the afternoon. And if you're with us this afternoon, maybe we can, have a discussion about that. So your screen keeps flashing.
I know, it's Teams. So there we go. I won't touch it.
Okay. 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 May I invite a fellow planning board member over for pancakes?
And there's a next one. It's kind of like a follow-up. I think they're together.
Is the chair allowed to have meetings with legal staff outside of meetings regarding specific applications? Legal meetings, I'm going to leave that for Steve because there are particular RSAs. It's called like a non-meeting or meeting with counsel. So I'll leave that for Steve to clarify that. I mean, yeah, I mean, you can invite your fellow planning board member over for pancakes. But again, there's fine lines in this day and age. We have to, be really aware of all of the fine lines out there. Okay. So you can be friends with planning board members, but you have to have some boundaries and have to make sure of what those perceptions could be. Okay. I'm going to run into a planning board member in the grocery store. My kids go to school with, fellow planning board members. Our kids are friends. You're going to have those relationships and those connections, right? But the difference is if there's two of you that are constantly over in the corner talking at a meeting, or, you're constantly, going to sites together, it's the behavior, it's that perception. Hanging out, having friends with planning board members is not an issue. Just be self-aware of the perception, because it won't take long for an attorney to call into question your behavior, what you've said, and then the town will come into a court case, especially nowadays, where that seems to be it seems to be the answer for things, is to file a lawsuit. So just be aware of that.
All right, I am sorry, Stephanie, just 1 second. I'm trying to put more questions into this document. There we go.
Okay.
Next one, how do site plan regulations and town ordinances affect or overlap one another?
Oh, the other. Okay. So site plan regulations, kind of talk about, if you've seen my previous stuff about zoning in 101, you've got the master plan is at the top of your regulation food chain. And the master plan is required by law to have two chapters of vision and land use. And vision is how the community wants to see themselves in 10 years, in 20 years, and whatever. The community may want all warehouses in their community. We want warehouses and housing and Dunkin' Donuts. That's what we want in our community. So the master plan reflects that. And so the land use chapter of a master plan will say, okay, so our land uses in our town, our warehouses are allowed everywhere, Dunkin' Donuts are allowed everywhere, houses are allowed everywhere. So the land use and the vision section are the required chapters of your master plan. So once you have the master plan, then you come down a notch and you go to your subdivision regulations. So the subdivision regulations are the avenue for which the planning board can implement the goals of the master plan for the community. Okay, so the subdivision plans, subdivision regulations would enact having warehouses and residential and Dunkin' Donuts and provide the standards. Well, site plan. Okay. So site plan regulations would provide the standards for that. So if you're going to have Dunkin' Donuts, you have to have, enough traffic for, enough stacking for drive through. So your site plan regulations implement what the town wanted on top. So yes, they all need to talk. They all need to match. They do overlap, but there's a method to that madness. So that's why you have it that way. You can only have site plan review regulations if you have zoning. So you have a planning board adopts rules of procedure, elects officers, does a master plan, then they can have subdivision regulations without zoning, or you adopt zoning, and then you have site plan and subdivision regulations. So the site plan, if you don't have site plan regulations, then the planning board has no say in any commercial development or changes of use in your community. So if my community wants all Dunkin' Donuts and warehouses and residential everywhere, then my site plan regulations would tell someone coming in building a warehouse, this is how you do that. So they all should talk to each other. The regulations, they should all be complementary, not conflicting.
All right, so the next one is.
Yeah, I think I see that. Are questions, discussions of cell towers forbidden at planning board meetings, but allowed at vision meetings? 10-year review. Cell towers forbidden? I don't think that any discussion of any type of development at planning board meetings should be forbidden. I guess, Rebecca, if you're around, or maybe later this afternoon, in the later session, we can hash that out. But I would never recommend that no topic not be discussed at a public meeting or visioning meetings. Okay, can we get back to the responsibility for accepting applications from staff and assign it to the secretary? Sure. I mean, that's something that, within rules of, the planning board's rules of procedure, that, planning board rules of procedure, is the planning board's rule book, and that's how the planning board goes through, when their meetings are. That's your rule book that you have to follow, and it should be made available to the public. And Steve spoke a little bit about rules of procedure. The rules of procedure spell out what constitutes an application, when the planning board meets, how to deal with recusal for members, how to deal with discipline of members. Maybe, a member isn't showing up, so there's absenteeism. So your rules of procedure are what is the board's rule book to go by. Make sure you're reviewing that with your town attorney. But you can have the officers, the secretary in your rules of procedure can be the planning board member, is the one that accepts applications, over the counter on behalf of the planning board. Now, I'm not sure why you would do that if you have staff, unless unless there's some kind of other internal issue going on, because that would be the job of municipal staff to do that. Having the secretary of the planning board needs to be available when hours of town hall are open and there may be some logistics going on there, but you speak with your town attorney as to why you would want to do that. Normally secretaries of planning, for the planning board, can fulfill that role if there is no town staff. So, Jim, that's something that you need to figure out with your board and with your town attorney. Okay, can you define scattered? We frequently get applications that are still missing things like traffic studies, letters from committees, etc. These things change several times over the course of review. Where is the Rubicon to consider the application scattered? Okay. I guess, yeah, we have to be very careful with our terms, right? Like we talked this morning with Steve, whether plan acceptance or application complete, right? So we have to be very careful with our terms. Scattered, I just say the application is incomplete. I mean, if you frequently get applications that are still missing things like traffic studies, if your regulations say thou shall submit a traffic study, and I have not submitted a traffic study, nor have I submitted a waiver for that traffic study for you to consider, then you should not be accepting that application. It stops. Go get your traffic study or submit a waiver. Those are your options. So you should not be accepting things. You should not be holding public hearings if you have not done one of those, if you haven't gone down one of those roads. If it's complete, if they've submitted everything, they've checked off the checklist, they've submitted the traffic, they've submitted the wetlands, they've done this, they've done that, and it's a complete application, then it moves forward and the board considers it and they accept it as complete. If you're missing things that your regulations and your checklists say are required and the waiver hasn't been submitted and they didn't submit the information, then they should not be moving forward. Yes, traffic studies change, things like that, but in the time frame of an applicant going through the process, I'm not really sure. That would be something for third-party review to answer. But if I submit a traffic study and it's dated 2023 and I start, finally my development half of 23 into 24, that traffic study is probably still going to be up to date. So, but another reason for a third-party review. Is
Stephanie,
it proper
I think we're at 11:45.
Okay, perfect. Okay, very good.
So I will send these to the panel for the later session for the planners.
Sure. Okay. Great. So thank you everyone for your time and for your questions. And the planner is in, and the session Q&A is going to be good this afternoon. So appreciate again your time and your attention and questions. And we are now breaking for lunch. So enjoy your lunch, and we will see you at 12:45 for preparing planning boards for solar farms and EV charging stations. So thank you very much for joining us. We'll see you soon.